Welcome back. It's been over a century, but the name Jack the Ripper still hasn't faded into obscurity, and the serial killer's identity remains a mystery, one that the descendants of his victims are now hoping will be solved. They're throwing their support behind a legal application for a new inquest into the death of Catherine Eddowes.
In 1888, a shadow moved through London's fog, murdering 5 women in the East End with chilling precision. Jack the Ripper vanished without a trace, becoming the most infamous unidentified killer in history. But now, in 2012, scientists claim to have found him. DNA evidence, a bloodstained shawl, and historical records all point to one man. Aaron Kosminski, a mentally ill Polish barber, long suspected but never charged. The case appears closed, but the outcome is deeply unsettling. Not because the mystery is solved, but because how it was solved raises new questions about science, ethics, and the nature of justice. A monster in the fog. The autumn of 1888 was soaked in fear. Damp alleys of London's East End, a killer moved through the fog like a ghost. His victims, Marianne Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly, were all women living on the margins. Their lives were largely invisible to society, their deaths grotesquely public. Each murder was brutal, the work of someone not just intent on killing, but on making a statement. Throats slashed, organs removed with surgical precision. The violence seemed deliberate, practiced, even anatomical. Police officers, reporters, and the public quickly agreed this wasn't ordinary crime. It was something much darker. The newspapers gave him a name, Jack the Ripper. The letters followed, taunting, blood-soaked prose signed with the now iconic pseudonym. One note, sent to the Central News Agency, was accompanied by part of a human kidney. Another, dubbed the From Hell letter, came wrapped in horror and myth, claiming the next victim was already chosen. The public panicked, the police scrambled. Over 2,000 people were questioned. Hundreds were detained. Rewards were offered. Street patrols doubled. But nothing stuck. The killer always seemed one step ahead, vanishing back into the labyrinth of Whitechapel before the fog lifted. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. After the murder of Mary Jane Kelly in November 1888, the killings ended. The mutilated bodies, the press frenzy, the taunting letters, they all faded. Jack the Ripper had disappeared. What followed was a century-long obsession. Hundreds of suspects, dozens of books, films, TV series, conspiracies. The Ripper became a legend, a cultural shadow that stalked not only London's history, but the collective imagination of the world, a symbol of unsolved horror. And yet, in the volumes of speculation and red herrings, one suspect had been quietly mentioned from the very beginning. And decades later, his name would rise again from forgotten files and change everything. A forgotten suspect resurfaces. His name was Aaron Kosminski, a Polish immigrant, a barber by trade, and a man whose life was marked by paranoia, poverty, and silence. He arrived in London with his family in the early 1880s, settling in Whitechapel, just blocks from where the murders occurred. By the early 1890s, his mental health had deteriorated. He suffered from hallucinations and delusions, often refusing to eat food he believed was poison. In 1891, he was institutionalized. He would never leave the asylum again. But during the Ripper investigations, his name had already surfaced, first quietly, then with increasing concern among senior officials. In 1894, Assistant Commissioner Sir Melville Macnaghten drafted a confidential memorandum listing 3 potential suspects. Among them was Kosminski, described as a Polish Jew, a known misogynist, and someone who had shown violent tendencies. The memo wasn't made public until decades later, but it pointed to a man the police had watched closely and feared. Further support came from Robert Anderson, then head of the CID, and Donald Swanson, his chief inspector. Both men left behind handwritten notes that, when pieced together, revealed a chilling consistency. They believed Kosminski had been positively identified by a witness who refused to testify. That silence, likely due to ethnic tensions, fear of retribution, or lack of confidence in the legal system, meant Kosminski was never charged. And so he faded into the institution, into obscurity, into history, but he remained in the background of Ripper lore, a shadow behind a name half remembered by detectives long gone. Until over a century later, when a bloodstained shawl appeared and brought his name crashing back into the center of the world's most infamous unsolved case. What followed wasn't just forensic analysis, it was the beginning of a firestorm. The shawl that changed everything. In 2007, a British businessman named Russell Edwards purchased a peculiar item at an auction, a long, patterned shawl said to have belonged to Catherine Eddowes, Jack the Ripper's fourth canonical victim. The fabric, according to its lore, was taken from the crime scene by a police officer and passed down through his family for generations. The shawl was stained, deep maroon patches along the edges. Edwards believed it was blood, and more than that, he believed it might hold the killer's DNA. The idea seemed far-fetched. The murders happened in 1888, decades before DNA science was even a concept. But Edwards brought the garment to Dr. Jari Louhelainen, a molecular biologist and forensic expert. What began as a speculative curiosity soon turned into a multi-year investigation that would revive the case from the crypt. Louhelainen began extracting mitochondrial DNA, mtDNA, from the shawl, first from the blood stains, then from additional bodily fluids, including what he identified as semen. The process was painstaking. The samples were degraded, aged by time and exposure, and had passed through dozens of hands over more than a century. Still, Louhelainen pressed forward. He then obtained samples from two living descendants, one from Catherine Eddowes' maternal line, and one from a family believed to be descended from Aaron Kosminski's sister. And then came the announcement, a mitochondrial DNA match. The bloodstains matched Eddowes' female descendant. The semen sample matched the mtDNA profile of Kosminski's maternal line. In 2014, Edwards published a book proclaiming the case solved. And in 2085, with renewed testing and access to deeper DNA sequencing methods, he publicly declared the match was 100% conclusive. Media outlets seized the headline, Jack the Ripper was Aaron Kosminski, but not everyone was convinced. Because while the claim made waves, it also triggered immediate skepticism from scientists, historians, and legal scholars. The evidence had weight, but was it truly enough? The next phase wasn't silence or celebration. It was critique, and it was loud. Science speaks, but criticism roars. As headlines worldwide announced the Ripper's identity had been revealed, the scientific community took a long, cautious breath and began asking hard questions. First, there was the issue of mitochondrial DNA itself. Unlike nuclear DNA, which is unique to an individual, mtDNA is inherited maternally and shared by thousands, even millions of people. A match doesn't mean only one person left the material. It means one person from a shared maternal line could have. This wasn't insignificant, but it also wasn't the forensic equivalent of a fingerprint. Leading geneticist Sir Alec Jeffreys, the inventor of DNA fingerprinting, called the findings remarkable, but urged caution. Without full transparency, replication, and peer-reviewed methodology, he warned, any claim to a solved case was premature. In 2009, the Journal of Forensic Sciences published the study, but by 2024, it had issued an expression of concern, citing unresolved questions about methodology and sample handling. Critics focused on several points. First, the chain of custody. There was no official police record of the shawl being collected from the crime scene. Its origin story was passed down through family lore, not legal documentation. For a sample to be admissible in court today, it must be verifiably unbroken in custody. This shawl had been anything but. Second, there was the issue of contamination. The shawl had been publicly displayed, handled without gloves, even photographed. In some cases, direct descendants had interacted with the object before testing began. That raised serious concerns. Had modern DNA mingled with historical samples? And finally, there was the question of confirmation bias. Edwards had gone into the investigation already convinced of Kosminski's guilt. Critics argued this could have influenced the interpretation of ambiguous or borderline data. Science, they warned, must be guided by evidence, not narrative. The debate wasn't just academic. It reached the families of the victims, historians, and those working in forensic justice. Was this real closure or a rush to a convenient name? Kosminski, if innocent, would now forever bear the weight of infamy. If guilty, he died without consequence or trial, buried silently in an asylum. Either way, the rush to declare the mystery solved carried implications beyond headlines. And it pushed the case out of history books and into courtrooms, classrooms, and family circles, where voices now demanded more than theories. Descendants demand closure. By the time the 2025 announcement echoed through the press, Jack the Ripper identified, the descendants of his victims had been watching closely. Some had spent years quietly researching their family histories. Others had tried to move on from the legacy entirely. But now, with the public pointing to one man, Aaron Kosminski, the families were forced into the spotlight. Karen Miller, great-great-great-granddaughter of Catherine Eddowes, became the first to speak publicly. In interviews, she said what many were thinking: if science can give us closure, we deserve to hear it officially. She called for a formal inquest, not to prosecute the dead, but to validate the victims. For too long, their names had been overshadowed by the myth of the killer. Now, she argued, it was time for truth to serve the memory of those lost. Miller wasn't alone. Other descendants, including relatives of Annie Chapman and Mary Jane Kelly, expressed solidarity. Though many didn't claim expertise in DNA or historical law, they shared a deep need to have the case acknowledged, not sensationalized, not debated in documentaries, recognized. Russell Edwards, emboldened by support and confident in his DNA team's conclusions, retained legal counsel and began drafting a petition to UK authorities. His goal: to have Aaron Kosminski officially named as Jack the Ripper in an official government statement. Meanwhile, the media exploded. Tabloids published mock-ups of what Kosminski might have looked like. Talk shows dissected his asylum records. Social media fed a new wave of fascination and backlash. The public's appetite for true crime met its limits when dealing with real names, real descendants, and real trauma. Not all reactions were supportive. Historians and legal experts warned that officially naming Kosminski without a trial, without a clear forensic threshold, could set a dangerous precedent. "We don't try the dead," one legal analyst remarked, "because we can't defend them." The push for recognition was no longer about identifying a killer. It was about what justice looks like when it's too late to serve it. Should symbolic closure be prioritized over evidentiary caution? Can naming a historical figure restore dignity to victims, or simply rewrite the past for convenience? These were the questions that began circling uncomfortably through courtrooms and columns. And as emotions rose, another problem came into sharp focus. Kosminski might not have been the only suspect, or even the right one. Shadows of doubt, alternative suspects. Even as forensic headlines declared the case closed, skepticism dug in. Because long before the DNA claims, the Jack the Ripper file had never pointed to just one man. There were others, each surrounded by mystery, contradictions, and evidence. Some circumstantial, some compelling. Montague Druitt, a barrister and schoolteacher, was found dead in the Thames just weeks after the last canonical murder. Some speculated suicide by guilt. Others believed he'd been wrongly accused and folded under pressure. Francis Tumblety, an American quack doctor, was flamboyant, anti-women, and known to collect uteri, raising eyebrows but never leading to prosecution. Michael Ostrog, a Russian con artist. Walter Sickert, a painter obsessed with Ripper lore. And then there was David Cohen, whose institutional records closely resembled those of Kosminski and may have been confused with him in official memos. Each theory had flaws, each had its defenders, but collectively, they suggested a troubling reality. Jack the Ripper may not have been a single man. Behavioral analysis of the murder supports this. The level of violence, mutilation, and targeting varied between victims. Some experts argue that the earlier crimes were more restrained and that the final murder, Mary Jane Kelly, was dramatically more sadistic, almost ritualistic. Could the killer have escalated, or could multiple killers have mimicked a pattern in a shared urban terror? If the shawl analysis was flawed or even simply inconclusive, then naming Kosminski might do more than close the case. It might erase the contributions of other investigations, other victims, other possibilities. Some scholars urge caution. Naming one man can often stop people from looking further. And then there was the most haunting possibility. What if Kosminski was guilty, but only of one murder? Or what if he was a sick, delusional man in the wrong place at the wrong time? In our rush to solve the unsolvable, how much truth are we willing to overlook? And if closure comes at the cost of accuracy, are we solving a mystery or rewriting it? The problem with solved mysteries. When a mystery haunts the public for over a century, solving it becomes more than just a matter of evidence. It becomes a matter of identity, what we believe about justice, history, and the power of closure. But sometimes closure comes at a cost. By declaring Aaron Kosminski the definitive identity of Jack the Ripper, a number of uncomfortable realities rise to the surface. First, Kosminski was never charged. He was never tried. He was a man struggling with severe mental illness, institutionalized for delusions, hallucinations, and paranoid behavior. His recorded symptoms resemble what would now be diagnosed as schizophrenia. To name him a killer without legal recourse, even with DNA evidence, raises ethical questions. Misidentification in the modern age has consequences. Slandering the memory of a mentally ill man based on contested forensics risks not only his reputation, but how we understand mental illness historically. Kosminski was feared by police, yes, but he was also deeply vulnerable. Then there's the question of how the case has been handled over time. Russell Edwards, for all his passion, is not a scientist. He's a writer, an enthusiast, a public figure. His promotion of the shawl and the DNA evidence often felt more like branding than justice. Critics argue that his methodology lacked transparency, that it relied too much on amplifying narrative over scientific rigor. In the public eye, that blurring of roles is dangerous. When amateur investigation masquerades as forensic certainty, the line between truth and story disappears. And in the case of Jack the Ripper, a story is exactly what has kept the mystery alive for over 130 years. Worse still, the declaration of a single suspect creates what some historians call narrative lock-in. Once a story is told with confidence, people stop asking questions. They stop exploring uncomfortable alternatives. They stop investigating. And that's not just a loss to history, it's a loss to accountability. The Ripper murders were more than brutal killings. They were also indictments of 19th century London, its poverty, its treatment of women, its neglect of the marginalized. To focus too narrowly on the identity of the killer is to risk ignoring the context that enabled him. Case closed is a tempting headline. It suggests control, resolution, and justice. But in truth, there was no justice in 1888. No trial, no conviction, only 5 women murdered in darkness while the world looked on. And if solving the mystery means we forget that, then maybe we haven't solved it at all. Which leads to the real question. Before we name Jack the Ripper, are we sure we even know what we're naming? What still needs clarity? Even with the DNA claims and media declarations, the case remains riddled with gaps. The shawl, centerpiece of the 2025 breakthrough, still stands on shaky ground. No official record confirms it was ever at the crime scene. No documentation from 1888 places it with Catherine Eddowes, despite its bloodstained history. For over a century, the shawl passed from hand to hand, never sealed, never protected, never tested under controlled conditions. It became a family heirloom, not a preserved crime scene artifact. If contamination occurred, and experts suggest it almost certainly did, then the DNA extracted from it could be modern, could even belong to the very descendants used to validate the match. Then there's the type of DNA used, mitochondrial, passed down maternally. It can eliminate suspects, but it can't pinpoint individuals. Tens of thousands of people in 19th century London may have shared that profile. The match to Kosminski's maternal line is compelling, but not unique. Without nuclear DNA, which provides individual specificity, the claim remains suggestive, not conclusive. Even if we accept the DNA as authentic and the shawl as legitimate, One final problem remains. Did Kosminski commit all 5 canonical murders? The nature of the crimes varied. Some were rushed. Others were drawn out and ritualistic. Some victims were found in the open, others indoors. Police at the time couldn't agree if one killer committed them all. Some even believed multiple attackers may have mimicked each other. If Kosminski was responsible for one killing, does that make him Jack the Ripper? Or was he one of several predators moving through Whitechapel's chaos, each using the fog and panic as cover? These uncertainties matter because if the case is being used to name a man, clear others, and finally close the book on Jack the Ripper, then the foundation must be rock solid. And right now, it's not. Historians and forensic experts are calling for replication, for independent labs to test the shawl using modern, nuclear-based techniques, for transparency in chain of custody, for peer-reviewed oversight. Only then can the claim rise from theory to truth. Until then, we remain in limbo, caught between science and speculation, between public hunger for a name and the quiet, methodical process real closure demands. And in that space, the mystery lingers, not just in evidence, but in ethics, in accountability, and in the stories we choose to believe. The ethics of true crime closure. For over a century, Jack the Ripper has lived in shadow, his name unknown, his crimes infamous. But in 2020, when modern DNA testing pointed to Aaron Kosminski, a man long buried and forgotten, the line between science and justice blurred. At last, it seemed, the world had a name to place on the fog. But identifying a killer over 100 years after the fact raises an uncomfortable question. Can history ever be judged like a court of law? To many descendants of the victims, naming Kosminski felt like resolution. It gave weight to their grief. It offered a sense that the women who died in 1888, Nichols, Chapman, Stride, Eddowes, and Kelly, had not been entirely abandoned by time. But for historians, legal scholars, and ethicists, the outcome was more complicated. There was no trial, no defense, no cross-examination, just science, strong in some ways, uncertain in others, and a man who, in his lifetime, was never convicted, never even formally charged. Kosminski died in an asylum in 1919 after decades of mental deterioration. If he committed the crimes, he was never held accountable. If he didn't, his name has now been forever linked to history's most brutal serial murders. And that opens a larger debate. Should we name the dead as guilty without due process? Some argue yes, when the evidence is strong, when the public interest is clear, when the case is already mythologized beyond recognition. Others warn that even symbolic justice can become speculative punishment. That true crime culture, fed by television and tabloids, sometimes prioritizes drama over diligence. There is also the issue of precedent. If we name Kosminski, do we now go back through other cold cases and do the same? Do we risk rewriting history based on modern interpretation of incomplete evidence? And how do we protect historical truth while still honoring the emotional needs of those who live with inherited trauma? These are questions without easy answers, but they remind us that justice isn't always about names. It's about process. And when process is absent, when the accused cannot speak and the evidence can't be cross-verified, we are no longer in the realm of justice. We are in the realm of storytelling. And perhaps that's the real risk of solving Jack the Ripper. That in our quest for closure, we forget that closure itself is often a luxury history doesn't provide. Because in this case, what we close may not be the file, but the very possibility of deeper truth. A legacy written in uncertainty. So where does that leave us? In 2020, Aaron Kosminski stands symbolically, scientifically, and controversially as the prime suspect in the Jack the Ripper case. His name is now etched alongside the darkest figure in London's criminal history. His face, reconstructed from asylum records and imagined through the lens of forensic art, circulates widely. The mystery, long thought unsolvable, has found its villain. But does that make the case solved? Maybe not, because Jack the Ripper was never just a man. He was a failure of systems, a police force overwhelmed, a public obsessed with sensationalism, a city unable to protect its most vulnerable women. He was a symbol of everything broken in 19th century London: poverty, misogyny, anti-immigrant sentiment, and unchecked violence in darkened alleys. Even if the DNA is right, even if the shawl was truly at the scene and the match is valid, we have to ask, what have we really uncovered? We've named a man, but the conditions that allowed the murders to happen remain, in many ways, part of our cultural fabric. The way we treat victims, the way we idolize murderers, the way we crave resolution even when truth resists simplification. Kosminski may have been guilty. He may have been innocent. He may have been one of several, or none at all. But what's certain is this: Jack the Ripper is not just a name waiting to be revealed. He is a mirror reflecting the fears of a society then and now. And naming him doesn't exorcise the ghost. It simply gives the myth a new mask. And that's perhaps the most sobering truth of all, that some mysteries, especially the ones soaked in blood and history, are not meant to be solved like puzzles. They're meant to be understood. Because the real horror may not be that Jack the Ripper was never caught. It may be that we still need him to be. They may have named Jack the Ripper, but at what cost? The evidence remains debated, the process incomplete, and the truth forever tangled in shadows. Closure came without trial, without certainty. And perhaps that's the final horror, solving a mystery not to bring justice, but simply to silence the question.